What is going on, everyone? My name is Vincent and I'm back with another video, and in this video I got something really cool for you guys. I finally got myself a nice set of coilovers. Wait, give me a second. There we go, that is a lot better now. These are the MeisterR ZetaCRD Coilovers and they'll run you about $995. Now you guys might be wondering why I got MeisterR Coilovers instead of other popular brands like Tyne, BC, and VMAX. And I'll tell you guys why right now. To start off, they have independent ride height and spring preload adjustability. Not that it really matters because these are linear springs, and when you compress a linear spring, the spring rate itself is not going to change at all. The front springs are rated to around 6K and the rear springs are rated to around 5K. The rear coilovers also have an extended top hat to allow for more compression travel. Rubber mounts provide a softer ride in exchange for some handling. Also, between every collar and spring, there's a plastic washer to prevent them from corroding to each other. Now here's where we start seeing differences. The Tyne Flex Z only has 16-stage damping, the BC BR series only has 30-stage damping, the VMAX doesn't even have adjustable damping, while the Meisters have 32-stage damping on each coilover. Lastly, these coilovers have a digressive damping and a close ratio damping technology, which is what CRD stands for. That basically means that it's gonna handle bumps really well while not compromising any of the handling. And that is the main reason why I wanted to get these coilovers, because I live in New York City and the potholes everywhere are horrible. I wanted to find a set of coilovers that can improve the handling, but not completely ruin the ride quality. Alright, now that we're done talking about these, let's go ahead and check out our old suspension to see if we can tell the difference before and after we install these coilovers. So let's start off with the driveway test. Obviously the back can clear perfectly fine, but wait, pause right here. Take a look at this box and look at the clearance between the floor of my garage and the bottom of the car. I would say that's around 2 or 3 inches. It's a little tight, but I'm pretty sure it should be fine even after I install the coilovers. Now if we take a look at the actual slope to get onto the driveway, I don't think there's going to be any problems here. Alright, let's take a look at the body roll of the car. Pause right here. This red line is what I would say is parallel to the floor, and this green line here is about the angle that my car's body is at. We'll come back to this picture later and compare the body roll before and after we install coilovers. Lastly, let's go get some measurements. Right here we're measuring from the bottom of the front bumper to the floor, and it's just about 7 inches. Over here we can measure from the center of the hub to the fender, and if we do that, it is around 12.5 inches. And if we go to the rear of the car and do the same thing, it's around 12.75 inches. Lastly, if we go to the rails that are on the side, it measures around, let's say 5 inches or 4.75 inches. Now that we're done talking about that, you can see I have a new shirt on because it's actually the next day. I stopped early so I could go pick up a new set of wheels and tires, but you'll have to wait till my next video to see what wheels and tires I got. I'm just gonna say this beforehand, but don't expect any cool wheels or anything like that. I got them at such a good price that I didn't want to pass on them. Anyways, I've got the car jacked up already. We're gonna start on the rear of the car because there's literally only 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 bolts. Now before we actually start turning wrenches, I recommend to spray some penetrating fluid on all the bolts before you actually start working on this. So I've done that for the past couple days now and it should be okay. Now we're gonna start off by breaking loose this bottom shock mount bolt, and it's a 17mm, so we'll do that right now. Don't worry about taking this bolt out yet because there's a lot of tension on the suspension right now since everything is still connected. So what we're going to do is loosen everything, and that's going to make this bolt easier to pull out later. Now we can go ahead and break loose the sway bar end links, and they're both 14mm. So I've got a wrench on one end and I have a breaker bar on this end. And let's just crack this one loose. So I already got the bottom one loose, and now let's go ahead and get the top one loose. Go. So I managed to get the top bolt fully out, but the bottom is getting stuck halfway. It's loose enough so it's like this. As long as we disconnect the sway bar and the lower control arm, then it should be okay. Now that the sway bar end links are undone, we could go to the back, and there's 2 14mm bolts on the top that you need to loosen up. You might as well go put a jack or a scissor jack under the lower control arm so that when you loosen the top bolts, the whole thing doesn't just fall down. Just to clarify, the bolts that I'm talking about is this one here and this one here on the outer edges. Don't touch the bolts in the middle because that's actually going to unscrew this and release all the tension on the springs and basically blow this up in your face. I know it's not the best angle, but this is the best I can do right now. And just break these loose. There's one on the bottom as well. Alright, so that's 1. And that's 2. Now with those 2 bolts out, we can go ahead and take out the last bolt, which is the lower shock mount bolt right here. And that should just easily unscrew with a 17mm ratchet because we broke it loose before already. Once it's mostly out, you can go ahead and just pull it out like this, and it should wiggle itself out. There we go. So the scissor jack is now out of the way and all the bolts are loosened, so that means this can shake freely. So all you have to do is just step on it, pull the bottom out, and then the top follows with it. And there we go, your stock suspension is now out. So I actually just realized that this is not the stock suspension, these are TOKICO brand shocks. And I'm assuming the previous owner put these in to make the car handle better. That also means that the benchmark tests that I did before don't relate to the stock suspension, but instead relate to the TOKICO brand shocks. Also, the TOKICO shock is actually shorter than the Meister shock right now. So that means if I want to keep around the same height that I had before, I'm going to have to lower these by around 1/4 of an inch. And I'll show you guys how to do that later. To get the new suspension in, it's actually the same way as getting them out. I would say to put the top in first, and then slide the bottom into there, just like that. Now what you have to do is put the jack back under it and slowly raise it to line it up at the holes at the top. And then once it doesn't move, then you're set. It's a little hard to see that side, so I'll go ahead and show you this side. You want to put those two bolts back, like the one over there and over there. MeisterR gave us some brand new hardware, so I'm going to be using these instead. So I'll at least tighten those two bolts down by hand. Once those two top bolts are in, we can go ahead and get the end link bolt back in. And if it's not lining up, don't worry, it's because the other side might have tension on it from the stock suspension. So go ahead and do the other side, and this should line up pretty well. So just get that in to where it was before. After you've got the end link bolt in, then go ahead to the bottom of the shock and get that big bolt back in. If it doesn't line up, then play around with the position of the lower control arm, and it should slide in just like that. Now go ahead and just snug this last bolt down, and we're not going to torque any of the bolts down yet because the suspension needs to be under a load in order for it to torque down properly. Now what we're actually going to do now is adjust the height of this coilover to drop it down 1/4 of an inch to match the height of the old suspension. So what you would do is take the small spanner and put it on the bottom collar and just break that loose like that, then spin it up about 1/4 of an inch. Now you take the big spanner and go to the top and spin the whole body clockwise to thread it into the lower body. And once I think it's at the right height, I'm going to go ahead and tighten the bottom collar back up. And then measure each side to make sure that they're at the same height, which it is, so these are set. So I'm actually on the other side now because it's going to be easier to show you how to torque things down on this side. It's the same exact thing on the other side, but I have more space on this side, so I'm going to be showing you guys here. So what we're going to do now is put the jack under the lower control arm and lift the suspension up to load it as if the car's weight is on the suspension. And that basically means to lift it off the jack stands just by a little bit. There we go, now the weight of the car on this corner is on the suspension and we can torque everything down now. So the top two bolts here are torqued down from 22 to 27 foot-pounds, so I'm going to torque them down right now. The big bolt on the lower control arm is torqued down from 54 to 69 foot-pound. And the end links are torqued down from 27 to 40 foot-pound. And after you've torqued that last bolt down, then that's it for this side. Go and do the exact same thing on the other side, then we'll move on to the front. The front is basically the same thing as the back. Break loose the bottom shock mount bolt, and then we'll move on to the end links. One difference is that the top bolt for the end links is a 17mm while the nut is a 14, but for the bottom, both of them are 14mm. We just need to loosen the bottom one because as long as we disconnect the end link and the sway bar, then we should be okay. So it turns out that when I was trying to remove the top bolts, the cruise control actually gets in the way of this bolt right here. So what I did was just remove a 10mm bolt here, loosen the 10mm bolt here, and loosen a 12mm bolt over here, and then I can just push this out of the way and get access to that 14mm bolt right here. So we've gotten out the two bolts that mounted to the top, and we've disconnected the end link from the sway bar. So that means we should be able to take it out after we disconnect the bolt that connects the shock to the lower control arm, right? Wrong, because even if we press this down with our foot, this upper control arm is really going to get in its way when you're pulling this out. You could do it this way, but it's going to be really hard, and it's easier honestly to just take the upper control arm bolt out and let this whole assembly drop down, and this comes out like nothing. It's a little hard to see right now, but there's a 21mm bolt for the upper control arm right here, and there's also a 21mm nut on the other side. So to drop this down, you need to take that whole long bolt out, but to take the bolt out, you need to actually take off this bolt for the sway bar. You don't need to take it out all the way, but at least halfway out so that this bolt can slide out like that. So you're definitely going to need a breaker bar for this. And let's see if I can crack it loose like this. So I broke the bolt loose, and now I have a ratchet on this end with the breaker bar on this end so that I could just crank it loose and it'll come out just like that. Now that the upper control arm bolt is basically loose, we're going to go to the sway bar bolt and loosen it halfway. Now we're going to spin off the nut, and there's also two washers, and make sure you remember where they go. Like this. Next, go ahead and get a jack to support the control arm to make sure that this doesn't fall down, because once you take that bolt out, this is going to drop. Next, go ahead and get a hammer and then give the bolt a couple taps to bring it out. Now it should be able to slide out like this. My bolt is not coming out, so that means I have to unscrew this sway bar bolt a little bit more. Alright, there we go. So now you could pull the upper control arm back like this, and it drops down all the way here. And after you've pulled the upper control arm out, you can lower the jack, and this should be able to go down a lot more. And at this point, you could just push it down, and it'll fall out just like that. I forgot to take out the lower shock bolt, so we'll do that right now. Like that. Now it'll come out just like that. If you wiggle a little bit, there we go. There we go. Now the old suspension is out for the front too. Now to get the old one in, you just put it back in the same way that you took it out. Now this is where you're gonna need the jack to line it up all together. Once you've got the coilover lined up at the bottom, then you could go ahead and get the upper control arm back in, and then slowly just jack it up to line it up with the holes at the top. Just like that. To give you a better idea, basically put the coilover back where it belongs in the hole at the bottom, then just push the upper control arm back into place at the top, and then use the jack to help you push up the suspension and line up the holes at the top, like this. Then I'm gonna snug down the bolts at the top. Now we can go ahead and get the upper control arm bolt back in, and we have to pass it through the back, like this. But don't forget to put the washer in before you put it through the control arm. Sometimes you'll have to shake it just to line it up a bit. And honestly, just play around with it until you can get it to pass through smoothly. There we go. And for the other side, get the big washer in, the small washer in, and then put the nut back on it. Just hand tighten everything for now because we're gonna need to load the suspension just like we did before by jacking it up. Then we could go ahead and get the end link back in place. There we go. And don't forget the nut on the back. Lastly, get the lower control arm bolt back in for the shock, and don't forget the washer and the nut that goes on it. Alright, now we're gonna jack it up again to load the suspension, then we'll torque everything down. Just like before, the top is torqued from 22 to 27 foot-pound. The lower control arm bolt is torqued from 54 to 69 foot-pound. And the upper control arm bolt is actually torqued from 87 to 101 foot-pound, so some people might need help with this. And both end link bolts are torqued from 27 to 40 foot-pounds. Lastly, don't forget the bolt right here. This is the bolt that holds in the sway bar. That's the one we took out to pull out the upper control arm bolt. This one is torqued from 14 to 20 foot-pound. Once you've torqued everything down, that's it for this side. Do the exact same thing on the other side and make sure you preload it when you torque it down. So I finished torquing up the last corner, and that means all 4 corners of this car are done. But I'm probably not going to take it off the jack stands until tomorrow because I've been working all day. It's been 97 degrees all day. I was devoured by... can't even speak right now. I was devoured by mosquitoes and I'm disgusting right now. So I'll see you guys tomorrow. I'm also gonna install my under tray again because if you guys don't remember or you're new to this channel, my very first video was actually me resealing my oil pan because it had a leak like you can see right here. And I never installed my under tray back because I always wanted to keep checking on this leak. Now it's been about 3 months since I actually made that video fixing the leak, and there's been no leak whatsoever. It's completely dry, so that means I did a good job. If you haven't seen the video yet, go check it out right here. So now that there's no leaks, let's get this back under the car. Now I'm not gonna show that because it's so easy. It's only like 10 bolts. So I'm just gonna skip the taking the car off the jack stands. Now here's the moment of truth to see if I can still get my jack out from under the car, because the coilovers were considerably lower than the stock suspension on the fronts. I also have wood blocks just in case, so let's see if this works. Will it come out? Yes, it does. So I measured the car and it's actually the same on the back while it dropped a 1/4 inch on the front. So that means I shouldn't really have any problems pulling out of the garage or getting off of my driveway because it's basically the same height right now. And I'm not worried about it being the same height because the suspension does have to settle, which is kind of like braking in coilovers. But it basically means that the coilovers are gonna adjust to the weight of the car. So by settling, that's actually gonna drop my car about half an inch. And after it settles, that means I can start fine-tuning the suspension and get the fitment that I want with the new wheels that I got. So I'm actually just gonna take the car around for a drive, and then we'll see if there's any weird noises, popping, clicking, rattling, and then we'll see what happens after that. So here's the driveway test, and of course there's no issues pulling out of the garage. That means there shouldn't be any problems pulling off the driveway either. And now we're back to the body roll test. Here's a snapshot of the car, and over here are the angle lines. It might look like a similar angle to before, but there's actually a reason for that. So I kinda messed up the results by going to a completely different place than the first time that I did the test, and now the angles kinda look similar to each other. But because I had a lot more space in the test after the coilovers were installed, I ended up going faster and swerving harder, as you guys could probably hear from my tires screeching. It still shows improvement because if you think about it, I can turn harder and get a similar amount of body roll compared to when I had the old suspension and I wasn't turning as sharply, if that makes sense. Basically, I had to push the car harder to get the same results as before, which does mean that the handling improved. If you're coming from stock factory suspension onto these coilovers, then you're definitely gonna see a big difference. In my case, I was coming from an $1,100 setup, which was the Taquico shocks, flying Miata springs, and the flying Miata top hats. It was a pretty good setup, but it's old and beat up, and it's not adjustable, so it's not what I'm looking for. So the handling did improve, but the biggest difference was definitely in the comfort. Keep in mind that the MeisterR ZetaCRD Coilovers are mainly designed for street use and the occasional track day, so this setup is perfect for me. After driving around for a bit, I could definitely say that these coilovers are worth it. Especially for people who live in areas with bumpier roads like I do and don't want to drive like this all the time. These coilovers feel smoother over bumps than other coilovers that I've experienced, but it definitely does not compromise any of the handling, as you guys saw in the body roll test. Also, when I drive now, I'm not going to hear any squeaks or rattles coming from the suspension. Anytime I hit a bump with the old suspension, it will sound horrible and it sounded like it was going to explode. In the end, I think coilovers are one of the best investments you could do for your car, and the Miata is definitely built for handling, so why not go ahead and improve it? So I was looking at it, and it actually turns out that the car dropped about half an inch after driving around for 15 miles. But I'm still going to give it at least a week to settle before I bother adjusting it. So maybe in my next video, I'll lower the car more, fine tune my adjustment, and get my new wheels on. I might also show you guys how to do an alignment right here at home in your garage. Anyways, that's going to be it for the installation and a brief review of the MeisterR ZetaCRD Coilovers. Go ahead and let me know down in the comments whether you think I should slam it or keep it practical. If you enjoyed the video and it helped you install your suspension, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. And if you want to see more videos, then go ahead and subscribe. Thank you guys so much for watching, keep smiling out there, and I'll see you guys next time.